Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you.
Here we are at the end of May.
It is the end of May. It is the end of Mental Health Awareness Month. We're going to talk about in traditional fast, like we've been talking over the last couple of weeks. We're going to cover a really tough topic today. Topic that's in the news, related to so many things that have been going on. And related to the last couple of podcasts that we've done, where we've hit kind of some really heavy topics. We're going to continue that today.
Right. It's kind of odd. It's sadly odd. In the past couple of weeks, we talked about banning books in schools. How do you solve that problem? And then last week we talked about the Buffalo, New York shooting, the grocery store shootings, and the idea that adverse childhood experiences might explain why some people elect to become mass murderers, and the contribution of adverse childhood experiences to that. And lo and behold, another week. And last week we talked about that in the first 19 weeks of 2022, there had been 198 mass shootings. Mass shootings defined as 4 or more casualties. And that was the week around May 14th. And then a week later, we have the tragic events at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. And again, another 21 victims. With the book banning, and so we thought, well, this is sadly, there's a sad juxtaposition here between what we've been talking about and the events in Uvalde. And so we thought, I don't think there's anything we can add. If you're reading anything or you're listening to the news, I think that people have really dissected and discussed the events in Uvalde. And I just don't think there's much that we can add to that. But then it struck us that, this whole idea of mass shootings, guns and gun violence in the United States is our complex problem. Different generations have had complex problems. And people say, well, and especially they'll ask us as mental health providers, why would somebody do that? We don't have the answer to that. I think you raised a really good point last week when you said, I think it was after the podcast, you and I were discussing it, and you said, okay, we know all these things, but why does where's the tipping point that somebody starts shooting?
Right, because we talked about ACEs last week, and let's just be honest, there are millions of people who have moderate to high ACEs scores that never become violent. There are millions of people with mental health conditions and mental illness that never become violent. Right. But there's some other factor. And one of the other things we talked about is, and we wrote about this in our column in the newspaper. We wrote about bias and how we tend, if we look at a lot of these individuals who have committed such crimes, they are hyper focused on certain things, and there's so much of it rooted in fear. And so we have these pieces, but those pieces alone don't really paint the picture for the puzzle. There's one more piece that we don't know what it is, and we can't. I don't know that we'll ever know what that other piece is.
That's right, and I think that therein lies the key. Now there are a couple of books written. I've ordered one of them, but there are people who are starting to address the idea. But I don't think anybody's come up with a real good explanation of what happens that somebody like this fellow in Texas or the Buffalo, what happens that you put on this military gear and get these high velocity, high impact weapons and start shooting people? What is that difference? Because, we talked about mental illness. Plenty of people have mental illness. They're not shooting up schools and grocery stores. It doesn't matter what factor you look at. So right. What this means then, and we freely admit nobody knows what turns a shooter into a shooter. Okay,
Right.
we know the contributing factors. We don't know the cause. So therefore, this becomes one of those complex problems
Right.
that it's not the only complex problem faced. Certainly climate change is a complex problem.
Sure.
Income inequality is a complex. So we have many complex problems. We've had them throughout our history. And as a species, we've had complex problems. So right now, this whole idea of shooters is a complex problem in need of a solution. I think we all agree that we have to come up with some sort of solution because it is a problem. It's a complex problem, but one that needs to be addressed.
Right. And similarly, the issues that we talked about with book banning and everything, that is another complex problem, because what we're talking about, what type of information should people have access to? And,
Right.
and is certain information appropriate for certain people?
Right.
We talked the other week about the committees that we were on to help evaluate some books that a group of individuals had concerns that were in the public schools, public school libraries. And, again, we can kind of look back at history and we can see where different groups that, perhaps at the time and in those communities or in those countries at the time, what was happening seemed okay. I can understand it that,
Right.
that Hitler would say that we need to do this, and they go right along with it, and then later we look back at it and say, oh my gosh, they banned all those books and they were burning the books, and what they were burning were ideas and beliefs and things like that. But we have this still happening now, with what's happening in Russia, and what's going on there is very similar because they're banning information.
That's right. You can be sent to prison for 12 years if you do a newscast in Russia and you call the Ukrainian invasion a war. Using the word war will get you a 12-year prison sentence. So many news outlets have left Russia because they're afraid of crossing that line. And that's one man. Alexander Putin is saying you're not allowed to use these words. You're not allowed to talk about this. Okay? Right. So it's a very slippery slope. These are complex issues with complex solutions. And you can't just say, we're going to ban this or ban this or ban, censorship is censorship. And most of us don't want other people making that decision for us, right, whether it's Putin or anybody else. So this idea of books, it's a complex issue and it's going to require a complex solution. You just can't yank them off the shelf.
Right. And I think that's the important point, whether we're talking about books or we're talking about guns or we're talking about whatever. When we're talking about some of these things, people don't like other people telling them what to do.
Right.
And that is part of the problem, because we've grown up believing certain things or thinking certain things, and that's where we want to stay. Right. And it's very difficult for many people to shift some of those ideas and to shift some of those perspectives and to see, okay, if we do something about this, what is that? Where are we going with that? Where's that going to happen? And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is kind of go through a brief history of a few things where at the time people thought this is unbelievable. All of our rights are being violated and we can't believe that we're doing this. And people talked about mental health and psychological consequences of some of these things, some of these decisions that are going to happen.
Right.
And it didn't work out the way that the people who feared it thought that it would.
Right, exactly. And so if Buffalo was shocking, what happened in Uvalde was just mind-numbing. I think that's where everybody is right now, is that we're just saying, people are ready to throw up their hands and say, what in the world is going on? What creates this sort of thing? And then we have all the predictable reactions. And I'm pleased to see that this whole idea of, political elected officials saying, well, our thoughts and prayers are with you. I think we're all tired of hearing that. This is a problem that needs a solution. And to say, well, our thoughts and prayers are with you isn't going to solve this problem, okay? So in the past 2 weeks, we've had another, 8 to 10 12 mass shootings. So the question then arises, what causes a person to commit these crimes? We don't know. What is the cause? We don't know the root cause. And is there any way to prevent? So I think there are two questions here. What is the cause? And is there any way to prevent these from happening again? So everybody has an opinion. It's guns, it's mental illness. You know, the governor of Texas got up and he blamed mental illness. You know, that was his conclusion, that, well, this is mental illness. There is no single cause. We first of all, we don't know what it is, but we do know that it's not a single cause. And we also know that it's not mental illness, okay? Right. It's not just bad parenting. It's not just godlessness. People say, well, when we took religion out of schools, or we took God out of schools, that this, no, this was all going on. That's not the cause, okay? Is it ACEs? We think ACEs, we think adverse childhood experiences contribute. We don't know. Is it the gun lobby? The gun lobby has contributed to it, but it's not a single factor. So there are many, many factors. And so how do we solve what we call a complex problem? Well, if we go back in our own history, our recent history, right, we can take a look at other complex problems that we solved. And so this next section of the podcast, we can title Cigarettes, Corvairs, and Integration. Some of you don't even know what a Corvair is. So but we'll talk about that. Many of us can remember a time when airplanes and restaurants had smoking sections.
Well, many of us can remember when there wasn't even a smoking section. It was just.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
Okay, because you're half my age. You know, you're a few years younger than I am, and so you can remember you could smoke anywhere you wanted.
Right.
Okay, you could smoke in airplanes. When I was in college, we could smoke in class. I mean, to my kids, that's incomprehensible. Right. That you could actually smoke. The teachers smoked in class. Right. I mean, they would smoke cigarettes or pipes or whatever they had, and when you were done, you threw it on the floor and stepped on it, and so you had cigarette butts all over your college classrooms. And so, but many people don't remember that. And if you go back to another generation, cigarettes were actually given away. Right. During World War II, and up until 1976. Cigarette companies would package these 3 or 4 cigarettes and some waterproof matches, and they would put them into rations that were given to soldiers, along with chocolate bars and freeze-dried food or dehydrated food, and we would actually give them away. Okay, right. So watch old movies. Go to Turner Classic Movies, and smoking was sexy. It was considered sophisticated. And
it wasn't until the 1990s. Right. That it was banned in most public places, and now we have tobacco-free campuses, and now if you watch a movie, part of the rating system, if a movie has cigarette smoking in it, that bumps the rating up to at least a PG or PG-13. So it went from something that was not just popular, but almost expected, as part of the rations for our soldiers, right. Something that was widely used to, it became a public health problem.
Exactly. When it was put, so here we have this over these years and over our lifetime, suddenly something that was it was ubiquitous. I mean, people just smoked, pilots smoked in airplanes. Okay, right. You could smoke anywhere you wanted. You could smoke in a hospital. Right. I worked in a hospital in the 80s, and we smoked in our offices in a hospital.
Well, Richard, and remember, I remember when I was a kid, the thing that they always said that fathers did when their child was born was pass out cigars in the waiting room. And
in the waiting room,
they were smoking cigars while after they got the information that the child had been born. So yeah, it was pervasive. It was everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And even if you were a non-smoker, you were still okay. So over those years, we learned that, indeed, cigarettes are dangerous to your health. They are related to disease and death. So over the years, and in just a few years, we went from a perfectly normal activity that everybody accepted everywhere
Mhm.
to the 1990s, where there are complete bans. There are tobacco-free campuses. You can't use tobacco in any form when you're on this campus, okay? So that's a huge change, but it was a very complex problem. There were many, okay, there was resistance from smokers. You know, people said, wait a minute, this is a right. I have a right to smoke if I want to smoke, okay? There was resistance from cigarette companies, okay? These companies had lied about their own research, and the tobacco lobby succeeded in keeping politicians in line.
Right.
What happened eventually was that the government, the United States government, had to step in because the tobacco companies weren't policing themselves. They weren't publishing the data that they had. That's what we found out later,
Right.
when the investigation was completed. So even though people were arguing that it's their right, smoking bans have prevailed. Okay, it was seen as a public health issue, and that we knew that cigarette smoking was killing smokers as well as non-smokers. And so eventually the government stepped in and said, we have to stop this. We know this is a problem. We have to solve the problem. It was a complex problem,
Right.
but it was solved.
Right. And now another complex problem that was addressed and eventually managed and solved is started with a book written in 1965, right? And Richard, I can remember as a kid, so even though this was 65, I 10, 15 years later, I can remember riding in the back of the car and with, just riding, or even riding in the front seat of the car, but without a seatbelt on. So in 1965, Ralph Nader, who, he ran for president a few times and and everything. He wrote a book entitled "Unsafe at Any Speed: The Designed-in Dangers of the American Automobile," and he talked about some of those built-in design flaws.
Right, and he focused particularly on a car called the Corvair. Right, it was made by Chevrolet, and the idea was after World War II, these engineers had seen rear-mounted engines in the back of the car. That's where the Volkswagen was in Europe. The engine was in the rear. So they wanted to bring this technology to the United States. So one of the first companies was General Motors, and they built the Corvair. And the idea was they wanted to get rid of that drive shaft. There was a hump in the middle of a car.
Right.
In the back seat of the car, in the front of the car, the transmission, and in the back. And we used to stand on that hump when we were kids, right? Not only were we not seated without a seatbelt, we actually stood on the hump of a car, okay? And so that was the drive shaft. Well, that if you put the engine in the back, you didn't need that hump, so you got rid of the hump. So they went through all these models to get this rear driven car to market. Now, the engineers who developed this knew about this flaw, that it affected the steering, and you couldn't control the car at certain speeds. That's what he meant by unsafe at any speed. The engineers knew this. The engineers knew that it was flawed. In fact, the Ford Motor Company got a hold of 2 Corvairs, and they test drove them. And in both cases, they had problems with the steering, with managing this car. They would flip over, okay? And so everybody knew this, but the engineers either remained silent or they were silenced by the company.
Right.
Prior to Nader's book, which started to reveal these design flaws, prior to that, the only thing that was ever discussed was driver error.
Right.
If there was an accident, there were like 50,000 people a year, and there weren't as many drivers then as today. And it was always driver error. The driver did something wrong. And Nader's book said, let's look at the car. Let's take a look at the automobile, okay? And maybe the automobile or something about automobiles was also contributing to this complex problem. Mm-hmm. And as a result of this book, a year later, the United States, but the Congress of the United States, imagine this, the Congress of the United States within 1 year had passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, and later on the Highway Safety Act, okay, which was a range of safety features built into cars, like padded steering wheels, because, why? Because in accidents, you would be forced into the steering wheel, which is a rigid steel frame, and it would puncture your chest, right?
Yeah.
Seatbelts came from this, the idea of seatbelts, safety glass that didn't explode on impact. It would break but not shatter. Rear breakup lights, the stuff that we take for granted today was built into this law, but it was a law that Congress said we have to take action. This is a problem.
Right, and all of this led to other things that we see, because wasn't it, Richard? Wasn't it the Gremlin? There was a car that
and the Pinto, right?
The Pinto. They were pretty popular, but they had the engine in the back. But they found that, you know, if the car was rear-ended, you were at risk for a car exploding or something.
It would explode in flames, right?
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, these kinds of laws came in to protect us, because prior to that, you know, car companies really just made the cars the way that they wanted to make them. And again, as you suggested, you know, there were rules, but they, you know, even if they found something wrong with it, they weren't necessarily any mechanisms in place to say, hey, we should do something different, or we need to change this, or we need to monitor this. And so with the passing of this law, they created all of these protections so that we can drive safely. I mean, Richard, if you think about it, when you drive down the interstate, you're driving, you know, 70 miles an hour,
right,
in a vehicle that weighs half a ton next to somebody else who's doing the same thing.
Right.
And you're only a couple of feet away from each other. So to think that, you know what, maybe we should make sure that these things are safe.
Yeah, when you have children and they turn 16 and you think, wait a minute, I'm going to hand you the keys to a 2,000-pound weapon.
Right.
I mean, it becomes that, you know, right. And you have to, you know, is this 16-year-old ready? I mean, the 16-year-olds aren't causing most of the problems. It's people who drive, you know, recklessly. So, but again, we see the government stepping in and saying, we have to, this is a complex problem. It's going to require all of us to work together to solve some of these problems. Okay, right. The automobile industry fought against these regulations. Of course they will, but they fought against them. Drivers didn't want to use seatbelts. They say, I have a right to drive without a seatbelt. Well, then you made it a law. You know, you have to wear a seatbelt because it's a public health issue. If you get hurt in a car accident, somebody has to pay. Some emergency room has to take care of you because you didn't want to wear a seatbelt. Yeah, you had the freedom not to wear it. So there was a law passed that said, no, you have to wear one. It's best. It's best if everybody wears one.
And with both of the examples we've talked about so far, part of the outcry was, well, you know, if you ban cigarettes from bars, then the bars are going to close down because nobody's going to go to them. Or if you do this with vehicles, the costs are going to be so great that, you know, we're not going to be able to do. But yet the bars didn't close.
Right.
Yet the automobile industry continued to make automobiles. So even though these fear approaches, tactics were used to try to prevent some of these things from happening, they happen anyways. It didn't. The doomsday warnings did not come about.
That's right. With both of these things, people predicted a catastrophe. People predicted it didn't happen in any case. In fact, we're safer now because of this. Okay. So now the third issue, we go back to 1958. This, I did not know about this. In 1958, a 38-year-old man had a master's degree from Case Western Reserve. That's a pretty prestigious university in Cleveland, Ohio. He applied to the doctoral program at the University of Mississippi. When he arrived, the governor and members of the State Highway Patrol greeted him at the university, which to me is, it's hard to imagine that, isn't it? That a governor would bring the police to the university, and they had him forcibly removed from the registration area. And then they arrested him, put him in jail. Then two physicians came in and declared that he was mentally ill. Mm-hmm. And he was actually placed in a state asylum.
And the rationale is that he must have been insane to think that, hey, a Black man could attend an all-white Southern university.
That's right. That was the rationale for arresting him and putting him in a mental institution. It makes me think of in Stalinist Russia, if you didn't buy the party line, you must be insane. They didn't jail people, they put them into institutions, because you have to be insane if you're not accepting what our propaganda. There has to be something wrong with you, okay?
And this happened even though this was like years after Brown versus the Board of Education, which said that it's just remarkable that could happen.
Because 4 years earlier, and this is what's shocking. So in 1954, we have the famous Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said, no, separate is not equal, even though all other cases prior to that, the Supreme Court said that separate and equal is okay, back to the 1800s. Now the Supreme Court in 1954 said it's not equal, and African Americans, Black Americans should be able to attend schools with white children. Okay, so this is 4 years later, and he gets arrested and gets put into a mental institution. Now, fortunately, his brother was an attorney, and he got him out after a couple of weeks. Had his brother not been an attorney, I shudder to think what would have happened to this guy. Just with a master's degree, teaching at Alcorn State, he was a college professor with a master's degree in 1958, and he's put in an insane asylum because he applied to an all-white school. Okay? It's a complex problem.
It is a complex problem, and all three of these were complex problems. And as we said, two of them were public health issues, and the other was related to equality and equal access. But all three involved powerful companies and corporations and institutions, and lest we forget lobbyists and politicians who pushed for laws to be written, to sort of to control the narrative, to control what was happening, to control what we heard about and what we saw and what we could think and what we could know about these things.
That's right. In each case, you had this combination of powerful corporations and institutions. I mean, these universities were like corporations. I mean, they didn't want Black people in these universities. And so if you were a senator from a tobacco state like Virginia or North Carolina, you needed that money from the industry. If you were from Michigan, you needed the automobile manufacturers to support you. Okay. If you were from the South, in the South in these years, segregation was law, and it was a way of life. I mean, it was just this assumption that the races would be kept apart. Okay. These elected officials were fully aware of what was expected of them. Okay. And so you have all the same ingredients. First of all, in all three cases, you had special interest groups. Okay? In all three cases, you had people insisting it wasn't the car, it was the driver. Okay. The problem is not the object, the problem is the person. You had people insisting that it was their constitutional right to smoke, to not wear a seatbelt, to attend, to keep the races separate. I mean, these were constitutional rights that people argued that they had. You had people insisting that the races were meant to be separated. That's what people did. And you had politicians who were part of, they were part of the problem. They were asked to craft legislation they were afraid to craft legislation that would protect the people that they were sworn to serve. Okay. They needed, if you were in Michigan, you needed the car manufacturers. If you were in the South, you needed them. If you were a tobacco state, you needed that money. Okay, so we understand all of that, but these are the same arguments that are being used today with our complex problems, whether it's climate change or guns or gun violence or whatever it is. Okay, so if we fast forward to 2022. It's exactly the situation that we're facing with gun violence. Right.
And so many other things, as you just said, because, when you think about when we were talking about the cigarette situation, so many of those same arguments were used about vaccinations, right? It's my right not to vaccinate. Well, you not vaccinated increases the risk for other people.
Exactly.
But like smoking increases the risk for other people because there's no vaccinated or unvaccinated line at the store. There's no smoking and non-smoking. At the time, there were no smoking and non-smoking restaurants. It was, and we wouldn't do that anyway. We wouldn't say, okay, this restaurant is, again, thinking about 40, 50 years ago, there would be no restaurants like that. So we are dealing with the same issue, these same problems in so many specific issues, whether it's vaccinations, whether it's, like you say, global warming or climate change, and especially with gun violence, because that is such a passionate issue for so many people.
Right.
And so many people say, well, there's just not a solution to it. Well, we may not know exactly what the solution is right now, but nobody thought that we knew what the solution was to these other problems,
That's right.
Either.
That's right. We don't know you and I have said that we don't know exactly what's causing these kids and their kids, they're young, under 21. The worst massacres are by people younger than 21.
Right.
Okay? All these shooters are 18, 19, 20. We don't know, but we do know there is a way to solve these problems because we've done it in the past. We've done it with other very complex issues, issues that people were passionate about. Smokers are passionate. Okay, tobacco companies are passionate. Drivers are passionate. Segregationists are passionate, and integrationists are passionate. Okay?
And a lot of those in the past dealt with constitutional rights as well.
That's right. Many of these were constitutional issues. Okay, so how do we stop the slaughter? Because and also we might add. Do you remember "Stay in Your Lane"?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Remember, pediatricians were told you can't talk about guns. Stay in your lane.
Right.
And that pediatrician said, "This is my lane."
Even though accidental gun discharge or accidental gun injuries is very common in young children.
Right.
Pediatricians couldn't ask. We're told that they weren't allowed to ask if there were guns in the house.
Right. Many of these shootings are caused by. Not caused. Many of these shootings result from kids getting access to their parents' weapons. There was
a case recently where a small child was in the backseat of the car playing with a gun. For some reason, there was a gun in the backseat with a 3-year-old, and he accidentally shot his mom.
Right.
And died.
Right.
Right there in the car.
3-year-old and a loaded gun
in the backseat of the car together.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so we know that kids getting access to their parents' weapons is a problem. Okay, we know that's a problem. And yet the National Rifle Association said to pediatricians, I think in Florida, there was a law passed that said pediatricians you're not allowed to talk about this. You're not allowed to ask if there are easy access to weapons. We do risk assessments. And one of the questions is, does your child have access to weapons?
Right.
Are there guns in the house that are kept out in the open? And so what we're not allowed, and that's what I mean by these gag orders. You're not allowed to talk about some of these things. Well, you have to talk about some of these things, okay? So when we talk about coming up with a solution to a complex problem, there are ways to do that.
Right.
And so number one, there are no absolutes.
Right. Yeah, we can't say you can't talk about this, or you can't look at this, or you can't research this. We can't have absolutes that prohibit us from finding answers to the questions. Right.
Imagine if somebody had said in 1965, okay, we can have a discussion, but we're not talking about the car.
Right.
Yeah. We can have a discussion, but we're not going to talk about cigarettes. That's off limits. We can talk about anything else you want to talk about. We're not going to talk about mixing the races. If you want to talk about educating people and you want to talk about providing services to people, that's fine. But we are not going to discuss integration. We are not going to mix the races. Imagine if any of those had been in place, that we never would have solved the problem. Right. I mean, you remember George Wallace famously saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Well, if you start with that,
right.
How do you can't solve a problem. So there cannot be any absolutes. We have to talk about guns. We have to talk about the Second Amendment. We have to talk about all the factors that might be contributing to this problem. If we're going to solve the problem, everything has to be on the table.
Right. And I think that the second thing that we have to do is we have to recognize that gun violence is a complex issue. It's
Right.
not, it's not just the guns. It's not just mental illness or soft targets or evil people or any of those kinds of things. It is much more complex than that.
Exactly. And we have to face it as a complex problem. Okay. There is no single cause, there's no single issue.
Well, and you mentioned it earlier that we try to say, okay, well, we're going to lock down the schools and we're going to make them, Fort Knox. We're going to make them. You said a moment ago that many of the shooters, a majority of the shooters, are under the age of 21,
right?
Which means that many of these shooters, and we also know that many of the shooters, especially at school shootings, attended the schools.
Attended the same school.
So they have listened. They have been there for all of the drills.
Right.
They have been there for all of the practice. What do we do for a lockdown? What do we do for active shooter drill? What do we do for a gun? If there's a fire, they've been there for all of those things. They know all of those procedures.
Right. They know the safe places. They know the unsafe places.
Right.
Because they've already been trained.
Right. So we can't just say, oh, well, we're just going to keep training the schools, or we're going to keep, keeping them locked down. It's not. It's a false sense of security that we're trying to impose there. And once we really think about it, that's not the answer, not in and of itself.
Right, exactly. No, it's not just schools. Gun violence isn't only happening in schools. Okay?
Right.
So it's happening everywhere now. And so it used to happen, we used to hear about it in schools. Now it's happening everywhere. Okay. This third rail, this idea of the Second Amendment, I'm sorry, guys, we got to put Second Amendment on the table.
Right.
The Constitution is a living document. The founding fathers had the good sense to make the Constitution a living document that could be changed to reflect the realities of whatever whatever the future was going to be. Now, they couldn't predict the future, but they knew that they would probably have to have a document that needed to be changed. So there's nothing sacred about any particular amendment. We've had 20-some amendments, changes to the Constitution. There's nothing sacred about any one of them. We could take any amendment, take the Eighth Amendment, okay? Is there something sacred about the Eighth Amendment? Is cruel and unusual punishment, okay? Right. Solitary confinement is considered cruel and unusual punishment now, according to the Supreme Court, okay? But we still are putting people in solitary confinement, okay? Right. A 20-year prison sentence for, we had 3 strikes and you're out. Remember, in California, we had that law, 3 strikes and you're out, which means you get maximum prison time if you've done your 3rd offense. Well, what if your 3rd offense is shoplifting a $2 bottle of Mountain Dew? Okay.
Richard, I evaluated a guy one time whose final offense that they were ready to put this guy away to prison. He had serious mental health issues, mental illness. He had schizophrenia. He literally stole a betta fish, okay, a cup with a betta fish in it. I think it was a couple of dollars, right. But in his mind, he wanted a pet. He was homeless, and he went into a pet store, but that was going to result in him not getting help for his mental illness that contributed to so much of these issues. Right. But they wanted to send him to prison for, I think, 20 some odd years for the accumulation of
these little petty offenses, right? So they're going to be, okay, that's the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment says we shouldn't do that. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, okay, so we shouldn't do that, okay? But we still do it. There's this messiness about these amendments, okay? What about the 18th Amendment?
Right.
Prohibition, okay? 18th Amendment to the Constitution. This is written into law. You cannot drink in the United States. And the 19th Amendment said, let's get rid of the 18th Amendment, okay? So that was a fiasco because it created, it sort of created the mafia or allowed the mafia to step in. The 22nd Amendment, that a president could only serve 2 terms. Who would have thought? Well, you had Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression and World War II, so circumstances were such that he got elected 4 times, okay? Nobody could have predicted that in 1783, but lo and behold, in 1945, that suddenly became an issue. So the Constitution. So this is a living document. And gun ownership is no more sacred than anything else.
Right.
I mean, why should the Second Amendment be any different than any other amendment? These are living documents. Nobody could have predicted. I mean, when the founding fathers, and I don't want to get into an argument about the Second Amendment, I'm just saying that the Second Amendment is no more sacred than any other amendment.
Right.
It's a malleable, changeable document.
Right.
And it has to be on board. It would be like, we're not going to talk about guns. Then let's not talk about cars and cigarettes. Okay. We had to talk about cars and cigarettes in order to solve the problem.
Right. And with all of that in mind, solving this problem may cause, or may require government intervention.
That's right.
The government, because, to pass laws or amendments, they had to be involved to solve previous complex problems. And so they may have to be involved again now. That's
right. I used to teach this in my classes. Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954. Berney, when were the schools desegregated in Polk County?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't know.
It's in the 80s.
Yeah. I knew it was in the 80s. It was years after, many years.
30 years later. Okay. So 9 years after Brown versus Board of Education, the first 2 Black females went to the University of Alabama. Okay. And it was only after President Kennedy sent in the National Guard. We had to send in the Army for these 2 girls to go to the University of Alabama in 1963. It was not 9 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Just by changing a law still may not solve the problem. Right. You might have to send in the troops.
Yeah.
Okay? But you have to have leadership to make those difficult decisions. Dwight Eisenhower did it in Little Rock, Arkansas. He sent in the troops and said, no, these kids are going to go to this high school. But he had to send the military in to keep people from killing each other.
Right. And I think another issue that we have to recognize is that this is a problem that's relatively unique to the United States.
Right.
I mean, sure, some other countries have violence and things like that. But there are other godless countries. There are other countries where a lot of kids play video games and that do a lot of these same things that we do here in the United States.
Right.
They don't have some of these problems.
We're not the only country that has mental illness.
Right.
Every country in the world has citizens, has individuals who would be deemed mentally ill by any standard. Okay. Right. So there's something different. There were 2 mass shootings in Canada last year. We've had 200. There were 8 in Mexico. Okay. We consider Mexico a dangerous country. It's dangerous in some ways. The drug cartels, of course, are dangerous there, and they will kill individuals. But the United States is the only country that has these kind of mass shootings at this scale, at this rate. Okay, right. So there's something unique about America. People around the world, people in other countries are saying, "What is it about the United States?" Well, maybe we should be asking that question as well. Is there something, again, complex problem? What is it about America that we're almost unique? We are unique in this regard of mass shootings.
Right. And you just mentioned mental health. Again, that is a great example of the complexity of the problem, because there are so many mental health issues.
Right.
And, to be diagnosed with a mental illness requires real specific criteria and those kind of things. But, you have people with subclinical symptoms. You have people who, we have acute onset of symptoms, and so they don't really meet the criteria for anything. But when a person has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that first break is what they call it, a first psychotic break that a person with schizophrenia may have had absolutely no symptoms or nothing before that first break.
That's right. No, it's true. I mean, we have these diagnosable disorders. When people say to me, and I know this happens to you as well, people will come to us and they'll say, well, is this kid had to be mentally ill, right?
Right.
And they you don't realize the complexity of that question, because there's mental illness that is defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's one set of mental illness. But then there's distress. Okay, there's subclinical mental problems that are not, you wouldn't diagnose a person, but they could be in severe distress without having a mental illness.
Right.
Or they might be mentally ill and never do anything like this.
Right. And we talk a lot, and it's another issue. We talk a lot about mental health in the schools.
Right.
And it's great, you know, that we're pushing to have more mental health providers in the schools, and we're doing a lot to try to take care of students and things like that. But we have some of these things happening in the community as well. Buffalo, New York, it was in a grocery store.
That's
and
right.
So, yes, we may be doing some things in schools, but what about other places?
That's right. And when it comes to schools, when we talk about solving these problems in schools, we're talking about a couple of things. One is, okay, you want to make schools safer. So you have metal detectors, and you have locked doors, and you have, you know, you have drills, safety drills. Okay, so you make schools as safe as you can. But what's the other thing you want to do? Well, the other thing you want to do is you want to prevent these problems from occurring in the first place. Okay,
Right.
so how do we make students, because what we want to do is prevent them, which means we want to make schools kinder places, gentler places, where there's a more supportive environment, where kids who are having trouble can go to somebody in the school and know that they can get help. Okay, well, we call that social emotional learning.
And we've just recently did a podcast about people fighting against that.
And people now are going to school boards saying, we don't want you to do social emotional learning because you're indoctrinating our kids. No, we're just trying to make the schools safer by teaching these lessons about emotions, and telling kids that it's okay to come to us and we will help you. We'll work through these things with you.
Right.
To try to change the environment, the culture in the building. Okay,
Right.
That's also a piece to this complex problem. So when you have people saying, no, you can't talk about that, you can't talk about race, you can't talk about LGBT, those are non-starter. No, we're not going to discuss those things. Well, back we are to no, you can't talk about cars, you can't talk about cigarettes, you can't talk about mixing. No, you have to be able to talk about these things. If you want teachers to keep your kids safe, allow them to discuss what they need to discuss.
Absolutely. And so, you know, kind of wrapping this up and pulling this all together, we have a lot of work to do. You know,
Right.
we have to deal with the situation in the schools, and we have to, you know, give schools the opportunity and the permission to do what they need to do to fix the problems in the schools. Managing students, working with students, supporting students and their teachers, and letting them do their work.
That's right. Let teachers do the job. They're very good at this.
Yeah.
I mean, Bernie, you've spent 3 years in the schools. Most teachers are very good at what they do. Yes, there are some who are not so good, but by and large, teachers are dedicated and they're pretty darn good at what they do.
Right. And, you know, a lot of people are very critical of public schools. And I mean, we know that there are people who want to close public schools. They want everything to become privatized. And, and that's just not going to, there's just no way for that to happen. We need to stop this whole idea of, well, we need to just turn everything into charter or magnet schools.
Right.
We need a system that's in place for the majority of the population, because
That's right.
That's who is in public schools. The vast majority of the population is in public schools. If we didn't have that system, we would end up with a lot of people who are uneducated.
That's right.
The most dangerous thing is an uneducated population.
That's right. Right.
They don't.
Since the 1980s, what was that book? It was during the 1980s, Terrell Bell was Secretary of Education, and he wrote a book about public schools. And since then, there has been this call by politicians that we have to shut down public schools. Okay,
Right.
That's like shutting down police departments. Remember, everybody said you can't shut down the police departments. Well, you can't shut down public schools either. Okay, if you shut down public schools, then what? Okay, because in fact, we shut down public schools in March of 2020.
Right.
What happened?
It didn't go very well.
Everything came apart. Okay.
Right.
So be careful what you wish for. This idea of magnet and charter schools, people say, well, magnet and charter schools do a better job. Magnet and charter schools were alternatives to busing. Okay, so let's go back to why do we have those? We had those because when we wanted to integrate schools, one of the ways to do it was by busing. Parents didn't want forced busing, so they said, okay, give us another solution. And the solution was magnet and charter schools. They were never meant to replace or to be an alternative to public education. They've become that, okay? But if you have kids in a magnet school where they're all there voluntarily, their parents want them there, the teachers want to be there, it's easy to teach in a magnet school, okay? But what about the kids who aren't easy to teach? What about the kids who have behavior problems? What about the kids who come from violent households? There are no magnet and charter schools for them.
Right.
Okay. Everybody wants the easy kids. Everybody wants to teach our kids because our kids behave themselves and they do their homework and they have parental support. Everybody wants to teach those kids. What about the kids who don't have those things? Where do we put them? So when you talk about closing the public schools, that's what you're talking about, closing. Okay. There's a reason we have free public education, and it was to educate everybody, not just the few. Okay.
Right. And I think one of the biggest issues that we have to work through is we have to realize that we're not enemies.
Jesus.
You know, we are, there is so much divisiveness going on in the country. You know, Christians versus non-Christians, blacks versus whites, immigrants. We have, you know, gays versus straight. There are so many tribes, and I think one of the biggest tribes is left and right, or Republican and Democrat, or conservative and liberal, however it wants to be presented. And we all want the same thing. I mean, let's not forget that we all want a safe, successful life for all of our citizens. That's what we all want. We have different ideas and different ways of attaining that,
right.
Of helping people to, or it's creating an environment where people can achieve that. But we're not enemies. We want the same thing.
Right.
We just have different ideas and perspectives on how to do that, but we treat each other as though we are these mortal enemies that we have to defeat, that we have to demean and just be so aggressive towards. That as soon as you see somebody come up on TV or wherever, and one is printed in red ink and one is printed in blue ink, you know that there's going to be a fight.
That's right.
And it makes no sense, because fighting doesn't accomplish anything.
Right. I'm really, no matter how I vote, no matter where I worship, no matter what I think, I'm really not anybody's enemy. Right. Believe me, it doesn't matter. I mean, I have people I know, I have seen people, family members and friends, who get along just perfectly fine until they find out where you stand on a certain issue: abortion, Trump, immigration, climate change. Doesn't matter what the issue is. Okay, got a Second Amendment. Okay, once you find out, and it's called identity politics. Okay, once you find out that what a person's position is, you suddenly separate. You can't associate with each other anymore. If you feel that way, then we have nothing to talk about. You're my enemy. Okay. Well, that didn't happen accidentally.
Right.
Okay. We have entertainers who are on TV every day telling us that we should dislike each other, hate each other, not trust each other. Okay. We're all living in this country together. And yet we have many people, elected officials, media stars, they're not newsmen, they're media stars, who are telling us that we should really be afraid of each other and we should really hate it. You should really be afraid of these immigrants. You should be really afraid of these people of color. You should really be afraid of liberals. No, you don't need to be afraid of anything. You know, we're all in this together. We all want to go to the grocery store and not worry about being gunned down.
Right.
We all want to send our kids to schools and not worry about them being massacred.
Right. Yeah. So there are all these issues, and all of that, and we haven't even touched on the issues with, you know, the changing teenage brain, right. or you know, we haven't even talked about, you know, the issue with like assault rifles and things like that. You know, assault rifles aren't for hunting. So what are they for? So, those are a couple of things that we really need to focus on as well. But my goodness, we have to get through some of this other business and just come to the agreement that we're all on the same team. We all want the same thing. Let's put everything on the table and let's just have a decent adult conversation about some of these things so that we can figure out the best solution.
That's right. How did we get to identity politics? Do other countries do that?
Right.
I don't know. We have friends in England. I mean, they don't agree politically, but I don't think they hate I don't think they fear each other. I don't know. I don't know what it is. We talk about the teenage brain. Yeah, all these kids have teenage brains, but all teenagers have a teenage brain. But most teenagers are not shooting up schools and grocery stores.
Absolutely.
So is it the teenage brain? I don't know. Is every, and I think we should talk about assault rifles. You want to hunt, it has to be on the table. I'm not saying yes, no, or maybe. I'm just saying we need to discuss the role of assault rifles.
Right.
With the equation.
Right. So as our country is looking at yet another tragedy, and there's been a lot of tragedies that many of which don't even make it onto the news anymore. We need to keep in mind that, as we've said all along today, these are complex issues that require complex problem solving, and to solve a problem, you have to put everything on the table. You have to have the opportunity to talk about all possible causes, all possible solutions, and work together from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of perspectives. Everybody needs to be able to work together to solve the problem. That's how it's done, not through divisiveness, not through fear, not through just manhandling. We need to have a conversation to solve these problems.
That's right. And everything has to be on the table. Okay. Right. Even if you don't like certain things. And there are certain things that I think are, but it doesn't matter what I think. Right. Everything has to be on the table. If we're going to solve a complex problem, everything has to be there to discuss and to debate, to negotiate. We have to come to terms with this slaughter. I mean, there's no other word for it. We have a slaughter going on in this country every week. And we just have to solve the problem. It's going to take moral courage. It's also going to take political courage. Right. Somebody is going to have to make some difficult decisions. And it may have to be the federal government.
Right.
Yeah. In the past, it's been Congress.
Yeah.
Congress solved the cigarette problem. They solved the car problem, and they solved the immigration problem.
Right.
Why can't it solve this problem? It can, but it takes political will.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. Until next time. Stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.